chesslecture.com. This is International Master William Paschall, and we're going to start a sort of series here. What we're going to do is short lectures on endgames. The title of the series is Endgame Miniatures. This is Pawns Part 1. You see on the board, as we begin a position with kings and pawns, what we're going to do is just not only go into the position, but quickly lay down a few ground rules for how to evaluate endgames, and especially pawn endgames in this case. So before you go into concrete variations, especially in pawn endgames, I think what you really ought to do is pay attention to the important features. Really set in your mind what are the important features of the position. Well, let's see how many important features we can identify here. White has a pawn more, 3-2. This is very important, of course, obviously assuring white an advantage. Black has a better king position. This will probably offset the pawn advantage to some extent, but not that much. Another important feature of the position is, I should tell you that it is white to move, and therefore black has so-called opposition, which also gives black a little bit of a slight advantage in terms of evaluating the position. Not an overall advantage, but it weighs down white's overall pawn advantage a bit. And then finally what we have to take a look at are a few other factors. White's extra pawn isn't just any kind of pawn, it's a protected passed pawn, which means the pawn behind it cannot be captured. The pawn on e3 cannot be captured without the other pawn being completely passed and ready to make a queen. And now the final feature of the position, which is very important, is the fact that there are pawns on a4 and a5. When you're up a pawn, the more pawns on the board generally increase your winning chances. But in this case, there's a little complicating factor. The fact that there are rook pawns can lead to many drawn positions even when white is a pawn up. So these different factors, keep them in mind. We go through the following variations now. What should white do? Obviously it has to be a king move, because if he pushes his pawn to f5, it's simply lost. Okay. Anyway, this position is actually from 1934, Alatortsev versus Bartholomew, and we consider here all different moves. Possibilities included the logical king to d2. We're not going to go through every possible move. Of course, this is a mini lecture, but this is sort of the most logical. Pushing the king back, trying to push the black king back. If it goes forward to f3, obviously the white pawn will advance to f5. If black goes king f5, he is in fact lost because of king to d3. And white has a huge advantage. Just something like king to d3, the white king will simply improve its position steadily. So, after king to d2, the problem is that black has the following move, d4. And what this does, it breaks up white's pawn so that he'll no longer have a protected passed pawn. White very much has to take, pawn takes d4, and now king takes d4. And although white has an extra passed pawn, it's not enough to win because of the a pawn, because of the rook pawn. King to c2, king to e4, king to c3, king takes f4, king to c4, king to e5, king to b5, king to d6, king takes a5, and the king gets back in front of the a pawn with no problem. And that is an elementary draw. King in front of the a pawn, no way for the side with the extra a pawn to win. Okay, so that's our most logical variation, but it doesn't work. So here we can play around with some other ideas, and one of them is a winner. White would really like to gain the opposition, but how to do that? King f2 doesn't really help. It's the same thing, basically, d4. In this case, after pawn takes d4, black can play king takes f4. Because of his space advantage with his king, he'll win the d-pawn by himself with the king alone. So, no king f2, no king d2. We've got to look at other moves. f5 doesn't work. So by process of elimination, we've got to move the king backward, or else there is no win at all. Where to go? The winning move is actually king to e1. You'll see why in a minute. If black plays d4 in this position, white can take, pawn takes d4, and now black has a problem. It's not the same as the last position, because after king takes f4, white has the move king to d2, which actually wins. And the other possibility, after pawn takes d4, king takes f4, rather king takes d4, excuse me, we go the other way with king to f2. Now something like king to e4, king to g3, king to f5, king to f3, king to e6 or king to f6, king to e4, king to e6. And now you see the difference. After something like that, king to e6, king d4, king f5, king c5, king takes f4, king b5, king e5, king takes a5, and black is just a little bit too slow. If king to d6, king to b6, and he shoulders the black king out and white wins. So going back to the initial position, king e1 poses serious problems for black because d4 doesn't work. Black has to move back with the king, only move king f5. This is a sort of triangulation. White basically wins the tempo. King d2, king e4, and king e2. And we've stolen the opposition from black, and white wins. Because now if d4, pawn takes d4, basically the same thing, but it's worse. If king takes f4, king to d3, we'll win handily. And if king takes d4, same thing, king to f3. Should win easily. Very instructive endgame. Let's take a look at one more example in our mini lecture here, endgame miniatures. Let me set up the next position. Second position here, endgame miniatures, pawns part 1. We're looking at a whole new situation, also with white to move. This position was composed by a player named Georgiev in 1936. Once again, let's use that important idea that before we calculate variations, sort of weigh the position based on positional factors. White has very bad king position. Fortunately, in this situation, he's not down any material. Both sides have one pawn each. White has a passed pawn. Black does not yet have a passed pawn. That's a slight factor in white's favor. So, it looks grim for white, but not hopeless. Very bad king position. Slightly offset by the fact that he has a passed pawn, and he's not down any material. And he has the move in hand. Now, at this point, it really does look rather hopeless. Because any pawn move loses material. And in any case, the pawn's falling. If I wasn't really thinking this were a blitz game, I would intuitively move my king to the queen side near the pawn on a4 that will be remaining. But this isn't good enough. After king to d1, black will play king takes f3. And if king to, say, d2, king to e4, king to c3, king to d5. What's eventually going to happen is that black is not going to allow white to trade that remaining pawn off. If white could do that, he would end up in a position where there's one pawn for black, but his king, the white king, is in front of that pawn with a pretty good position. So, for example, black were to make a silly move here, like say king to d4, white has a5, and this would be a draw. But it's not so easy because black has the move a6. And this move is very unpleasant. He might even have another possibility, but it's not apparent to me. I think a6 is the move, and slowly white will get pushed back, and he's going to just lose that a pawn. King to b3, king to c5, king to c3, and what should black do now? a5. Fixing the pawn and gaining the opposition. King to b3, king to d4. The white king is pushed out. King to b2, king to c4, king to a3, king to c3, king to a2, and king to b4. Black will win with 2 pawns. Okay. Back to our initial position. Running to the queen side doesn't work. How about pushing the f pawn? Doesn't really change the position. After king takes f4, king to d2, basically have the same thing. That didn't help. And certainly it won't help to play king to f1, just going further out of position. King takes f3, black will win easily. So, there is one way to play here that we haven't looked at, and this move draws a5. Very important factor that you may not have recognized in our initial analysis of the position. If you push this pawn forward and it's captured, it's a draw because black has only rook pawns. And this is a key factor. If pawn takes pawn, king d1, it's a dead draw. Regardless of black being 2 pawns up, he can't win with only a rook pawn with the white king in position. So he must play b5. And now, there's also only one way to play. a6. Absolutely essential that white not allow black to establish a protected pass pawn. Now it's a draw. After a6, if b4, white simply moves in position with king d1. He's going to round up that b pawn with a draw. So king takes f3. This is the key position. Now he runs to the queen side. King d2, king e4, king c3, king d4, king d5, excuse me, king b4, and this is the trick, and it's very hard to see this in advance. King to c6, it looks like black's winning, but white has the move king to a5, and this is a stunner. Black pushes the pawn, it's a draw. And if he keeps the pawn with king to c5, it's a stalemate draw. Fantastic endgame. Both very instructive, and both kind of related by the fact that both have this theme that the rook pawn leads to a drawish king and pawn endgame situation. I hope you enjoyed this mini lecture here, Endgame Miniatures, Pawns Part 1. This was International Master William Paschall. If you enjoyed your coffee break, thanks again for joining.